It was a quiet Tuesday evening when my marriage ended. I remember standing in the kitchen, rinsing dust from my hands after a long day at a construction site. The sink water was running warm, and the house was unusually silent. No television, no music, just the low hum of the refrigerator behind me. My wife, Laura, stood near the window with her arms folded. She didn't look angry. She looked certain. That was the part one noticed first. Then she said something I still remember word for word. "My mother was right about you," she said calmly. "You'll never become anything." The words were quiet, almost casual. For a moment I thought she might laugh afterward, like it was some kind of joke that landed badly. But she didn't. She just stood there looking at me the way someone looks at a finished decision. A week later the divorce papers arrived. The legal process moved quickly, faster than I expected. Her mother had already arranged attorneys, financial advisors, and a long list of documents I had never seen before. By the time everything was finished, the house I had built over 12 years of work was no longer mine. It was a place overlooking the coast outside San Diego. Nearly $4 million in value by the time construction was finished. Every beam, every railing, every stone terrace had passed through my hands at some point. And then it was gone. Laura kept the house. She kept the savings accounts. She kept the vehicles and most of the investments. When the final papers were signed, I left the courthouse carrying a single box of personal items and a folder of debt statements tied to the construction company. I moved into a small apartment across town. The carpet smelled faintly of old detergent. The hallway lights flickered every few minutes. At night, the pipes inside the walls made a slow knocking sound that echoed through the place. It wasn't the kind of apartment you imagine when life is going well. But it was quiet, and quiet was something I needed. The first few weeks passed in a routine that felt mechanical. I worked small repair jobs when I could find them. Roof patches, fence posts, minor structural fixes people didn't want to call large contractors for. In the evenings, I sat at the small kitchen table with a notebook, trying to figure out how to keep the company alive with the little cash I had left. Sometimes I didn't write anything at all. Sometimes I just stared at the page. My younger brother, Daniel, stopped by one night with a bag of groceries. He set it on the counter and looked around the apartment for a long moment. "You planning to stay here forever?" he asked. I shrugged. "Just for now." He nodded slowly, like he understood something I hadn't said. Our mother visited once a week after that. She would bring homemade soup in glass containers and place them carefully inside the refrigerator. She never stayed long. She would sit for a few minutes, ask if I was eating enough, then quietly gather her coat. Before leaving, she would always squeeze my shoulder. "Take your time," she said once. I nodded. But the truth was, time didn't seem to be helping. 6 months passed that way. 6 quiet months. Then one afternoon there was a knock on my apartment door. It was firm, slow, not impatient. When I opened the door, a man in a dark gray suit stood in the hallway holding a black leather briefcase. He looked at me carefully before speaking. "Mr. Parker?" "Yes." "My name is Andrew Wells," he said. "I'm an attorney." He paused, as if choosing his next words carefully. "I represent Michael Langford." The name took a moment to register. Michael Langford was my former father-in-law. I hadn't spoken to him once during the divorce. The attorney lifted the briefcase slightly. "He asked me to bring you to his office," he said. "There's something he believes belongs to you." I looked at the briefcase, then back at the attorney. For a moment, I didn't say anything, because the last thing I expected, after everything that had happened, was a message from my ex-wife's father, and I had no idea what could possibly be inside that case. So I stepped back from the door. "Give me a minute," I said. Then I went to get my jacket, and that was the moment the story really began. Pause. I locked the apartment door behind me and followed Andrew down the narrow stairwell. The building always smelled faintly of old paint and laundry soap. I had grown used to it over the past few months, but that afternoon it felt different. Maybe because I knew I might not be coming back for several hours. Maybe because something about the lawyer's calm tone had stirred a small sense of curiosity I hadn't felt in a long time. Outside, the afternoon air carried the cool breeze from the ocean a few miles away. Andrew's car was parked along the curb, a clean, dark sedan, the kind of car that suggests someone values quiet professionalism rather than attention. He opened the passenger door for me. We drove without speaking for the first few minutes. Traffic moved slowly through the late afternoon streets. Small shops passed by the window, a bakery with a line out the door, a hardware store with stacks of lumber leaning against the wall outside. places that reminded me of the life I used to live. I watched them pass in silence. After a while, Andrew spoke. "Mr. Langford has been following your situation," he said. I turned slightly in the seat. "That's surprising," I replied. Andrew nodded once. "He prefers to stay out of family conflicts." But certain developments changed his mind. I didn't ask what developments he meant. Instead, I leaned my head slightly against the seat and watched the road. Laura's father had always been a quiet man. During the years of my marriage, I had only seen him a handful of times. He rarely spoke during family gatherings. When he did, people usually listened. He had built most of the Langford family's wealth through property development across Southern California. Large housing projects, commercial spaces, and mixed-use buildings. Most people described him as disciplined, practical, the opposite of his wife. My former mother-in-law, Victoria, had very different ideas about the world. She believed strongly in reputation, status, and the kinds of people a family should associate with. From the first day I met her, I could tell she had already made up her mind about me. I was the contractor with rough hands, the man who showed up in work boots, the one who talked about foundations, permits, and lumber deliveries instead of investment portfolios. Laura used to defend me in the beginning. I remember one dinner early in our marriage when Victoria made a comment about my work. "You're talented with tools," she said politely while cutting her steak. But talent with tools doesn't usually lead to influence. Laura placed her fork down slowly. "Mom," she said calmly, "he's building half the houses in this county." Victoria smiled in that thin way she had. "Yes," she said, "but builders don't usually own the neighborhoods they build." I didn't respond that night. I just kept eating and listened to the quiet clink of silverware against plates. Over time, the conversations changed. They became quieter, shorter. Laura stopped defending me quite as often. At first, it was small things. Questions about why the company wasn't expanding faster, why we weren't buying another property, why I insisted on managing construction sites myself instead of hiring more supervisors. I always answered the same way. Because the details matter. A building lasts longer when someone pays attention to the small things. But those answers didn't seem to satisfy her anymore. Looking back, I can see how slowly things shifted. Conversations became negotiations. Silences lasted longer. By the time the divorce happened, the distance between us had already grown wide enough that neither of us knew how to close it. The car turned onto a quieter road lined with tall oak trees. Andrew slowed as we approached a large brick office building set back from the street. "This is where Mr. Langford works most afternoons," he said. He parked near the entrance. The building looked older than most offices in the area. Not flashy, no glass towers or polished metal panels. Just solid brick and large windows shaded by trees. The kind of place built to last. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and wood polish. Andrew led me down a hallway lined with framed architectural drawings. Some of them looked familiar. I recognized a few developments my company had worked on years earlier. Housing communities we had framed and finished during long months of construction. We stopped at a door near the end of the hall. Andrew knocked once. A calm voice from inside answered. "Come in." The office was quiet. Large bookshelves covered one wall. A drafting table stood near the window. And behind a wide wooden desk sat Michael Langford. He looked older than I remembered, more gray in his hair, but his eyes were the same. Sharp, observant. He stood slowly as I entered. "Daniel," he said. I nodded. "Mr. Langford." He gestured toward a chair in front of the desk. "Sit down." Andrew placed the briefcase on the desk between us and stepped quietly to the side of the room. Michael rested his hands lightly on the desk for a moment before speaking again. "I know the past few months have been difficult," he said. His voice was steady, not sympathetic, just factual. "I've reviewed the settlement documents from the divorce." I said nothing. He opened the briefcase. Inside was a thick stack of folders. Contracts, property records, share agreements. He slid the top folder toward me across the desk. "You built several of my early developments," he said calmly. I nodded. "Yes." He watched me carefully. "Those projects performed better than any we had built before." I waited. Then he said something I did not expect. "Which means there are some financial arrangements that were never finalized properly." The room became very quiet. Michael opened the next folder and turned it so I could see the documents. I leaned forward slightly, because the first page had my name on it, and I didn't remember ever signing it. I picked up the paper. Then I started reading. And the longer I looked at the numbers, the more carefully I sat up in the chair. Then I looked back at Michael. He folded his hands calmly and waited for me to finish the page. Pause. I read the first page slowly. Legal language has a rhythm to it. Once you've worked around contracts long enough, you learn where the important lines usually sit. Ownership percentages, development rights, profit allocations. My eyes stopped on a number near the middle of the page. I read it twice, then once more. Michael watched quietly from across the desk. "This can't be correct," I said after a moment. "It is," he replied. The document described a development partnership formed nearly 9 years earlier. One of the first large projects my company had built for him. A residential community outside Carlsbad. I remembered that project clearly. Long days, early mornings, concrete deliveries before sunrise, framing crews working under portable lights late into the evening. It had been the job that pushed my company forward. But the document in front of me described something I had never been told. A profit participation clause, small at first glance, but tied to the long-term property value of the development. I turned the page. The next document listed 3 additional projects. Each one had the same structure: participation percentages, revenue distributions, ownership interests held through a development entity I had never heard of. I looked up. "I was never paid any of this," I said. Michael nodded once. "You were paid for the construction contracts." "That's all I ever saw." "Yes." The room stayed quiet for a moment. Andrew stepped forward and placed another folder on the desk. "These agreements were drafted during the early phases of each development," he said. "At the time, you were managing most of the site operations personally. The intention was to formalize your participation once the project stabilized." I looked at him. "But that never happened." "No," Andrew said. Michael leaned back slightly in his chair. "My wife believed contractors should be paid only for labor," he said calmly. "That's why she pushed the company to treat your work strictly as construction services." I set the document down. "And you allowed that?" "For a while." His answer came without hesitation. "I believed it would create less conflict in the family." The clock on the wall ticked quietly behind him. I picked up the next page. There were numbers attached to each development. Updated valuations, current revenue projections, property appreciation across nearly a decade. My throat tightened slightly as I read. The combined total sat at the bottom of the final page. It wasn't just a bonus payment. It wasn't even close. It was long-term equity. I placed the paper back on the desk. "Why are you showing me this now?" I asked. Michael didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened another folder inside the briefcase. This one contained copies of the divorce settlement, highlighted sections, asset transfers, bank statements, real estate ownership records. "I reviewed these documents carefully," he said. "Your share of the marital assets was minimal." "That's one way to describe it." "Yes." Andrew slid another sheet across the desk. "This is the current value of the development interest connected to your work," he said. I looked down. The number sat alone in the center of the page. 8 digits. For a few seconds I didn't say anything. Then I exhaled slowly. I didn't even know this existed. Michael nodded again. "That's the problem." He leaned forward slightly. "Daniel, the work you did created enormous value. Entire neighborhoods were built on the systems you designed and managed. You solved problems that our engineers struggled with for months. I remembered those nights. Foundation redesigns, drainage corrections, structural adjustments during inspections. Things most people never see when they walk through finished houses. You were never credited properly for that," he continued. The office stayed quiet except for the faint sound of the clock. I placed my hands on the desk and thought for a moment. 6 months earlier, I had been sitting at a small kitchen table in a 1-bedroom apartment, trying to decide which bills could wait another week. Now I was staring at documents that described an entirely different reality. Not sudden wealth. Something more complicated. Ownership. Long-term equity tied to projects I had helped build. I looked at Michael again. "So what happens now?" Andrew answered this time. "That depends on how you want to proceed." I frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Michael rested his hands on the desk again. "The agreements were never formally closed," he said, "which means they still exist." Andrew opened a thin folder near the bottom of the briefcase. "These documents confirm that the development entity still holds the equity shares," he explained. "And those shares are legally tied to your participation agreements." I understood what he was saying, but I wanted to hear it clearly. "So they're still mine." Andrew nodded. Yes. The room became very quiet again. For the first time in months, my thoughts didn't feel heavy. They felt organized, ordered, like pieces on a drafting table finally lining up. I looked back down at the documents. Then I asked the question that mattered most. Does Laura know about this? Michael's expression didn't change. No, he said. Neither does Victoria. I leaned back slightly in the chair, and for the first time that afternoon, I allowed myself a slow breath. Because suddenly the story of the past 6 months looked very different. Not finished. Not even close. Michael closed the folder gently. Daniel, he said calmly, there are several ways this can unfold. He paused, then added one more sentence. But the next step requires careful decisions. I placed the documents back inside the folder. Then I looked at him. All right, I said. Let's talk about the steps. Then I waited. I sat there for a moment looking at the stack of folders. For months my mind had been moving in circles, thinking about what I lost, replaying the last conversation in the kitchen, wondering where things had started to break. Now, suddenly, my thoughts felt different, clearer. Michael noticed it too. He leaned back slightly in his chair and folded his hands. Before we discuss options, he said, you should understand something. I looked up. These agreements were written years ago, he continued, but they were never canceled. Andrew opened another folder and slid 3 sheets of paper across the desk. These are the original partnership filings, he said, registered through the Langford Development Group. I scanned the documents. Company formation records, partner schedules, signature blocks. My name appeared again, alongside the projects I had supervised. What kept them active? I asked. Michael answered quietly, because they were never replaced. I nodded slowly. That made sense. In construction and development, paperwork often follows a strange timeline. Projects move quickly. Legal structures stay in place much longer. Sometimes years. Sometimes decades. Andrew tapped the corner of the document. The equity distributions were scheduled to activate once the developments reached long-term stabilization. When was that? About 3 years ago. I looked at him, and no one mentioned it. No, Michael spoke again. My wife believed the company should absorb the ownership internally, he said calmly. She assumed the agreements were symbolic. I almost smiled at that. Anyone who had spent real time around building projects knew something important. Nothing written in a contract is symbolic. It either exists or it doesn't. I placed the papers neatly back on the desk. All right, I said. Let's think about this carefully. Michael nodded once. That seemed to be the answer he was waiting for. So I did something I hadn't done in months. I organized the situation in steps. Not emotionally. Practically. I rested my hands on the table and spoke slowly. Step 1, I said. We confirm these agreements are still valid under state development law. Andrew nodded. They are. Step 2, I continued. We confirm that the development entity still holds the equity positions. It does. Step 3, I said. We determine whether those shares legally belong to me now or whether they were considered marital property during the divorce. That question hung in the room for a moment. Andrew closed one folder and opened another. This is where the timing becomes important, he said. He turned the page toward me. The document was a copy of the final divorce decree. Highlighted sections marked asset classifications. Property, accounts, vehicles, the house. I noticed something immediately. None of the development partnerships appeared anywhere in the settlement. Andrew tapped the margin with his finger. These assets were never disclosed during the proceedings, he said, because no one believed they existed. I leaned back slightly, which means, Michael finished the thought calmly. They were never divided. The clock ticked again behind him. I let the idea settle. For 6 months, I had believed the divorce had taken everything. But the legal system runs on documentation, and documentation doesn't respond to opinions. It responds to records. Andrew placed another sheet on the desk. This is the current valuation summary, he said. I glanced down at the numbers again. 8 digits, spread across multiple projects. Land value, rental streams, development appreciation, quiet assets that had been growing while I was patching fences and repairing roofs. I exhaled slowly. Michael watched my reaction carefully. You seem calm, he said. I shrugged slightly. Construction teaches patience. He nodded approvingly. That's true. The room stayed quiet for a moment. Then Michael spoke again. There is something else you should consider. I looked at him. My daughter believes the divorce settled everything. I'm sure she does. and my wife believes the same. Andrew closed the briefcase halfway. They will likely be surprised if these documents appear suddenly. I rested my hands on the table again. That part didn't worry me. Not anymore. Because something had changed in my thinking during the last few minutes. For months I had been reacting to events. Now I had information. And information allows you to move differently. I looked at the folders one more time. Then I spoke again. Let's proceed carefully. Michael tilted his head slightly. What do you have in mind? I answered the way I would approach a construction problem. Calm. Structured. First, I said, we verify every record. I want the full development history, ownership filings, and revenue reports. Andrew nodded. That's already being compiled. Second, I continued, we update the legal registration so the ownership is formally recognized. That can be done. Third, I said, we do absolutely nothing publicly until the paperwork is complete. Michael's expression shifted slightly. Not surprise. Something closer to respect. You're choosing patience. Yes. He leaned back again. That's wise. Because the truth was simple. Silence can be powerful, especially when other people believe the story is already finished. Andrew closed the briefcase and locked the latches. We'll need a few weeks to complete the filings, he said. That's fine. Michael stood slowly from his chair. So, he said, you'll move forward with the claim. I stood as well. Yes. He extended his hand. I shook it. His grip was firm but steady. Good, he said quietly. Because the next stage will require clarity. I picked up the folder Andrew handed me. The documents felt heavier than paper usually does. Maybe because they represented something more than money. They represented proof. And proof changes the way people talk. Andrew walked me back down the hallway. When we reached the front door, he paused. One more thing, he said. Yes. He adjusted his glasses slightly. Once these filings go through, your former family will eventually find out. I slipped the folder under my arm. That's all right, I said calmly. Then I stepped outside into the afternoon light. Because the next step wasn't confrontation. Not yet. First, the system needed to finish its work. And systems move quietly. The paperwork took just under 3 weeks. That was faster than I expected, but Andrew explained why. Most of the structures already existed. The development entities were active. The revenue records were clean. The only thing missing was formal confirmation of the ownership distribution tied to my work. So the process was mostly administrative. Forms, filings, verification. I spent those 3 weeks quietly returning to a routine. In the mornings, I still woke up in the small apartment. The pipes in the walls still knocked softly around sunrise. I still brewed coffee in the same chipped mug and sat at the same kitchen table. But something had shifted inside me. The heaviness that had followed me since the divorce was gone. In its place was something simpler. Patience. I stopped drinking in the evenings. I began reviewing old project notebooks again. Sketches from past builds. Site plans. Structural notes I had kept from earlier developments. Work had always been the way I organized my thoughts. One afternoon Andrew called. The filings are complete, he said. I placed the phone on speaker and leaned back in the chair. Everything confirmed? Yes. And the ownership positions? Registered. I nodded even though he couldn't see me. What happens next? Andrew paused briefly. Now the distribution notices are issued. Distribution to who? To all equity holders connected to the developments. I understood immediately. That meant every partner, every investor, every member of the Langford Development Group, including Laura and Victoria. Andrew continued calmly. They'll receive updated ownership statements within the week. I placed the phone face down on the table. Then I waited. 3 days later, I received another call. This one came in the evening. I looked at the screen for a moment before answering. It was Laura, the first time she had called me since the divorce. I answered. Hello. Her voice came quickly. What is going on? I didn't speak right away. She continued. I just received documents from my father's company. They say you're listed as a development partner in several Langford projects. Yes. What does that mean? It means the paperwork was finalized. There was a long pause. You never told me about this, she said. I didn't know about it during the marriage. Another pause. Then a sharper tone. My mother says those documents must be incorrect. I stood and walked slowly toward the kitchen window. The city lights were just beginning to come on outside. The documents are correct, I said. Dad never mentioned any partnership with you. I'm aware. She exhaled sharply. This doesn't make sense. I kept my voice even. The developments we built years ago created long-term equity agreements. And you're claiming those now? Yes. Her voice dropped lower. So you waited until after the divorce to do this? I rested my hand lightly on the window frame. No, I said it quietly. I discovered the agreements after the divorce. Another long silence. Then she said something that sounded more confused than angry. My mother is furious. I almost smiled at that. I imagine she is. What are you trying to do here, Daniel? I answered honestly. Nothing. What do you mean nothing? I'm recognizing agreements that already existed. Her voice softened slightly. So you're not trying to take anything from us? No. That's not how it works, she said slowly. I nodded to myself. She was beginning to understand. These shares were never part of the settlement, I said. They weren't disclosed. So they belong to you? Yes. She didn't respond for several seconds. Finally, she spoke again. My mother wants to arrange a meeting. I expected that. You did? Yes. Her tone shifted again. Will you come? I considered the question carefully. The past version of me would have answered quickly, emotionally. But that version had been living in a different state of mind. Now the situation felt clearer. This wasn't a fight. It was a reality. I'll meet with your father, I said. And you? And my mother? I thought for a moment. Then I answered calmly. If she'd like to attend. Laura exhaled slowly. All right. We'll arrange it. After the call ended, I placed the phone back on the table. Then I sat down again. The apartment was quiet. The same quiet it had been for months. But now the quiet felt different. Ordered. Calm. 3 days later, Andrew called again. The meeting is scheduled, he said. Where? At the Langford office. I nodded. That works. One more thing, he added. Yes. Michael will be there as well. That didn't surprise me. Good, I said. Then I hung up the phone. The meeting would happen the following morning. And for the first time since the divorce, I wasn't thinking about the past. I was thinking about clarity. Because when documents speak clearly, people usually stop arguing. They simply react. So the next morning, I put on my jacket, picked up the folder Andrew had prepared, and drove back to the same office building where the story had quietly changed 3 weeks earlier. Then I walked through the front door and waited. The Langford office looked exactly the same as it had 3 weeks earlier. Same brick exterior, same quiet hallway, same framed development drawings along the walls. I arrived a few minutes early. Andrew was already inside the conference room when I walked in. He stood near the table, organizing a stack of folders into neat rows. Morning, Daniel, he said. Morning. I set my own folder down and took a seat near the end of the table. The room smelled faintly of wood polish and coffee. Morning light came through the tall windows behind us, the kind of soft light that makes everything feel slower. Michael Langford entered a minute later. He nodded when he saw me. Good morning. Good morning. He sat at the head of the table without ceremony and folded his hands in front of him. No one spoke for a moment. Then the door opened again. Laura stepped in first. She looked almost the same as I remembered. Same calm posture. Same careful way of moving through a room. But there was something different in her expression. Not confidence. Uncertainty. Behind her walked Victoria. My former mother-in-law had always entered rooms as if she owned them. Shoulders back. Chin slightly lifted. The kind of presence that made people step aside without thinking. That part hadn't changed. What had changed was the situation. She stopped when she saw the folders on the table. Her eyes moved from Andrew to Michael to me. Then she took her seat. Laura sat beside her. Andrew closed the conference room door quietly. Michael spoke first. Thank you all for coming. Victoria leaned back in her chair. We received some very strange documents from your company this week, she said. I assume that's why we're here. Michael nodded. That's correct. Her gaze shifted toward me. And Daniel appears to be listed as a partner in several developments. Yes. She tilted her head slightly. That must be an error. Michael shook his head once. It isn't. Andrew opened the first folder and slid a document across the table toward her. This is the original participation agreement, he said calmly. Victoria barely looked at the paper before pushing it back. That document is nearly a decade old. Yes, Andrew said, which means it has no relevance now. Andrew turned the page gently. It does. He placed a second sheet on top. This confirms the agreements were never dissolved. Victoria's fingers stopped moving. For the first time, she looked carefully at the document. Laura leaned closer beside her. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Michael broke the silence. These developments were structured to reward the individuals responsible for their construction success. Victoria looked up. Contractors were already paid. Yes, Michael said. But Daniel's contributions went beyond construction contracts. Her voice sharpened slightly. This is ridiculous. Michael didn't respond emotionally. He simply nodded toward Andrew. Andrew opened the next folder. These are the stabilization records for the developments, he said. He placed 3 separate reports on the table. Revenue timelines, occupancy rates, appreciation values. Each page clearly labeled. Once the developments reached stabilization, Andrew continued. The equity positions became active. Laura looked up from the papers. You're saying Daniel owns part of these projects? Yes. Victoria's chair moved sharply against the floor. That was never discussed. Michael answered quietly. It was written. The room went silent again. Victoria flipped through the pages quickly now. Her movements had lost their earlier certainty. Why wasn't this included in the divorce settlement? She demanded. Andrew answered calmly. Because the agreements were never disclosed during the proceedings. Laura looked toward me then. Not angry, just confused. You didn't know about this? She asked. No, when did you find out? 3 weeks ago. She leaned back slowly. Victoria closed the folder with a firm motion. This will have to be reviewed legally. Andrew nodded. It already has been. He slid one final document toward her. This is the updated ownership registration filed with the state. Victoria stared at it. Her eyes moved across the line slowly. The silence stretched for nearly half a minute. Then Michael spoke again. Daniel's ownership is confirmed. Victoria looked up sharply. So you're siding with him. Michael's voice stayed steady. I'm honoring the agreements. She turned toward me. You expect us to simply accept this? I met her gaze calmly. There's nothing to accept. She frowned. What does that mean? It means the paperwork already exists. The room grew quiet again. Laura looked down at the documents one more time. Then she said something very quietly. So everything we believed about the settlement was incomplete. Michael nodded once. Yes. Victoria didn't speak again for a long time. Eventually, she pushed the folder away. This meeting is finished. She stood. Laura remained seated for a moment longer. Then she looked at me again. Are you planning to sell the shares? No, what will you do with them? Continue building. She nodded slowly. Then she stood as well. Neither of them said goodbye. They simply walked out of the room. The door closed behind them. The quiet that followed felt very different from the silence of the past 6 months. This silence wasn't heavy. It was settled. Andrew gathered the documents back into the briefcase. Michael looked at me across the table. You handled that well. I shrugged slightly. It wasn't personal. He smiled faintly. Exactly. And that was the moment the situation finally became clear. Not dramatic. Not explosive. Just resolved. Through records, numbers, and time. A few months later, my routine looked very different. Not dramatic. Just orderly. I moved out of the small apartment near downtown and into a modest house closer to the coast. Nothing extravagant. 2 bedrooms, a small porch, and a narrow backyard where the wind carried the smell of salt from the ocean in the evenings. The first weekend after moving in, I spent most of the day doing simple things. Cleaning shelves, organizing tools in the garage, setting up a workbench near the window. Those quiet tasks felt more satisfying than I expected. When life becomes complicated for a while, small routines bring a kind of balance back. In the mornings, I started walking along the same stretch of shoreline before work. Coffee in a travel mug. Cool air. The sound of waves rolling against the rocks. Then I'd drive to whichever site needed attention that day. Because the construction company had started moving again. Not suddenly, but steadily. The development shares Michael helped confirm gave me something more valuable than a windfall. They gave the company stability, access to credit lines, long-term planning. Within a year, we were supervising 3 new residential builds. Smaller projects than the big developments from years earlier. But they were solid, well-planned, the kind of work that lasts. My brother Daniel came by the house one evening while I was tightening the hinges on a cabinet door. He leaned against the garage wall and looked around. Place looks good, he said. Thanks. You ever miss the mansion? I tightened the final screw and closed the cabinet. No, I said honestly. That house had always felt like a statement. This one felt like a place to live. Our mother visited often. She would bring soup or baked bread and sit on the porch while the sun went down. Sometimes we talked about work. Sometimes about nothing in particular. Peaceful conversations. The kind that don't require explanations. I heard updates about Laura occasionally, mostly through mutual contacts in the development community. The large house by the coast eventually sold. Maintenance costs were high without steady construction income attached to it. Laura moved to a smaller place across town. We never spoke again after the meeting at the Langford office. There wasn't much left to say. As for Victoria, she remained involved in several investment groups. But people in that world tend to respect documentation more than opinion. And the documents had already spoken. Michael and I met for lunch once every few months, usually at a quiet restaurant near the marina. He rarely talked about the past. Instead, we discussed permits, land availability, and the future of development along the coast. One afternoon, after we finished reviewing plans for a new housing project, he folded the blueprint carefully and looked at me. "You've rebuilt things well," he said. "I'm trying." He nodded. Then he said something interesting. "You know, situations like yours happen more often than people realize." "What do you mean?" "People underestimate the quiet work others do," he said. "Then one day the paperwork surfaces." I smiled slightly. "That tends to change conversations." "Yes," he said calmly. "It does." A week after that lunch, I received a message from Andrew. Short and simple. Another contractor he knew had a situation involving development agreements that were never properly recorded. Andrew asked if I'd be willing to look at the documents and share my perspective. I placed the phone face down on the kitchen counter and thought about it for a moment. Then I made some tea, sat down at the table, and opened the file he sent. Because sometimes the most useful thing you can do for someone is help them understand what their own work is worth, even if it takes years for the system to catch up. That evening the house was quiet. The same quiet that had once filled the apartment months earlier. But now it felt completely different. Not empty, just peaceful. If you enjoyed listening to this story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps more people discover these quiet, real stories. And I'm always curious where everyone is listening from. Leave a comment telling me which city you're in and what time it is there right now. 2 more popular stories will appear on your screen in a moment, and you might enjoy those next. Until then, take care.